All right, strap in everyone, because today we are taking a deep dive into some seriously mind-bending stuff. We're talking about non-conceptual mental content.
I think a lot of people have had this experience. You just feel like you understand something really deeply, but you just can't put it into words.
Right.
Yeah, and that's exactly the kind of territory that we're going to be exploring today.
It's like, can you even think without thinking?
That's a good question.
Luckily, we've got some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help guide us through this. So get ready for some serious brain food.
It really is fascinating stuff. And I think one of the most interesting things about this topic is that it really challenges this basic assumption that we often have about how we understand the world.
Okay.
That everything boils down to concepts, to these neatly packaged ideas that we can express with language.
Right. Like, okay, so make sure we're all starting on the same page here. Let's just lay out, like, what we mean by conceptual content.
Sure.
Those everyday thoughts, beliefs, desires. Like, simple things like, I'm hungry, or cats are fluffy, or even abstract ideas like justice. We express these using specific concepts, right?
Yeah.
Those are like those building blocks of thought.
Exactly. But now imagine trying to represent the world without those conceptual building blocks.
Oh.
That's where this idea of non-conceptual content comes in. It's about grasping reality in a way that might be even richer
Right.
and more nuanced than our language can capture.
So it's not just about things that we're not consciously aware of. It's a totally different way of representing reality in our minds.
Exactly. Think about like a baby who can clearly see the difference between colors long before they actually learn the words red or blue.
Right.
Right? They're experiencing the world. Their minds are representing it somehow.
Yeah.
But not in a way that we can easily put into words.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do philosophers actually go about breaking this non-conceptual thing down?
Right.
It's not like there's a handy definition we could just point to in a dictionary.
Yeah, and that's what makes the debate so interesting. Philosophers have kind of identified two main approaches to understanding what non-conceptual content is all about.
Okay.
State non-conceptualism and content non-conceptualism.
State versus content.
Hmm.
All right, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack those a little bit. Starting with state non-conceptualism. So what's the core idea there?
So state non-conceptualism focuses on the mental state itself.
Oh, yeah.
The argument is that you can be in a certain mental state, like experiencing something,
Right.
without necessarily having a concept for it. So again, think back to that baby and the colors. Their mental state is taking in those visual differences, even though they haven't developed the concepts for red or blue yet.
So the mental state is like the raw experience happening before we can slap a label on it with the concept.
Precisely. Now, on the flip side, we have content non-conceptualism,
Okay.
which kind of dives into the nature of the content itself.
Yeah.
Asking, is the way we experience something fundamentally different from how we conceptualize it?
Okay, hold on. I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So it's not just about the experience itself,
Right.
but about the way our mind is representing that experience.
Exactly.
Like, is seeing the color red actually different from thinking about the color red?
That gets right to the heart of it.
Oh,
Can we even have the same thought based on a non-conceptual experience
right.
as we would from a conceptual one? It's like asking if a description of a sunset can ever truly capture the awe of actually seeing it.
Wow. Okay. See, this is getting really deep.
Yeah.
But this all sounds super theoretical. Where does this non-conceptual content thing actually show up in the real world?
Right.
Like, give me some concrete examples.
That's where things get really exciting. Non-conceptual content kind of pops up in a few key areas. Perceptual experience.
Okay.
Those subpersonal states, think like the inner workings of the brain.
Okay.
And then explaining how babies and animals understand the world.
Ooh, okay. I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Let's start with perception. So, like, does seeing, hearing, smelling, all that sensory stuff actually go beyond concepts?
There's a pretty compelling argument to be made that it does. Consider optical illusions, for example.
Okay.
We can see things that are logically impossible, but our minds can't actually believe those impossibilities. So, like, our senses get tricked in a way that our conceptual minds don't.
Like those drawings where the stairs are going up and down at the same time.
Exactly.
My eyes are telling me one thing, but my brain is like, nope, not possible.
Exactly. Another clue is that our senses seem to operate in this analog way, right?
Yeah.
They're taking in a continuous spectrum of information.
Right.
Think about like the infinite shades of color or the subtle variations in sound.
Yeah.
Concepts, however, are more digital, right? They categorize and simplify this rich sensory input
Right.
into these distinct units, like red or blue, loud or quiet.
So our senses are like a high-definition camera capturing all the detail, and our concepts are kind of like compressing that image down
Yeah,
to fit on a small screen.
perfect analogy. Then there's the fact that we perceive specific distances
Mhm.
without even needing units of measurement.
Right.
Like, I see that tree's about 20 feet away,
Right.
but my thought about it usually involves units, like feet or meters.
Yeah, and don't even get me started on colors.
Right.
We can distinguish way more shades than we even have names for. Our senses seem much more fine-grained
Yeah.
than our concepts can keep up with.
Yeah, that's actually a key argument for non-conceptual content and perception. That idea that our senses are capturing a level of detail that just goes beyond our ability to conceptualize it.
Okay.
But hold on. The conceptualists do have a counter-argument to this fineness of grain idea.
Okay.
They would say that we do have concepts for all of those subtleties, even if we don't have specific names for them. Like, think about what philosophers call demonstrative concepts.
Right.
Like, I can point and say, that shade of red.
Right.
You don't need a unique name for every shade.
Right.
If you can just point and say, that one.
Yeah. It's kind of like saying, like, every star in the sky, because you can just point at it and say, that one.
Right.
It feels a little bit like a cheat, right?
Yeah, it does raise some tough questions. Can you really remember every shade you've ever seen? Or are you just relying on your sensory experience in the moment? Can a baby even form the concept of red without first having those non-conceptual color experiences? These are the kinds of puzzles that philosophers are grappling with.
Wow. I'm already seeing how this whole non-conceptual content idea really throws a wrench into our usual way of thinking about how we understand the world. It's like there's this whole other level of mental processing going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And we've only just dipped our toes in the pool. We've still got the whole world of subpersonal states and how we explain animal behavior to explore.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's dive into those subpersonal states now.
Okay.
Those intricate workings kind of happening behind the scenes in our brains.
Like the secret code that's running in the background, making sure everything works. I'm a little curious and a little scared to find out what my brain is doing without my permission.
Yeah, it is a bit like a hidden operating system, Think about grammar rules, for example.
Right.
Your brain knows them and uses them constantly, even if you can't explicitly explain all the intricacies of, syntax and sentence structure.
So you're saying I'm a grammar whiz without even knowing it?
What, maybe not a whiz, but
okay.
It does highlight how much our brains are doing behind the scenes.
Yeah.
It's not just grammar either. Think about how our early vision processes work. They use concepts like zero cross.
Zero cross.
Essentially, detecting edges and boundaries in the visual field.
Okay.
We don't consciously grasp these concepts.
Right.
Yet our brains are using them to make sense of the world around us.
It's kind of mind-blowing to think about all this complex processing happening like under the hood without us having any clue. It makes you wonder what else our brains are up to that we're completely oblivious to.
It certainly raises the question, does this mean these subpersonal processes are truly non-conceptual?
Right.
Are they really representations in the same way that all thoughts and beliefs are? It hinges on how literally we want to take, content at this level.
Right.
Some might argue that it's more about information processing,
Okay.
not genuine representation in the way that we usually think about it.
So it's like our brains are running algorithms.
Yeah.
But we don't necessarily form thoughts or beliefs about those algorithms themselves.
Right.
Like a level of understanding that's operating like below our conscious radar.
Exactly. Now, shifting gears a bit, let's kind of zoom out from the inner workings of our brains to consider animal behavior.
Okay.
We often explain the actions of infants and animals by assuming that they have some way of representing the world.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, even my dog seems to understand that, certain actions lead to certain outcomes. Right.
Like sitting politely will get him a treat.
Right.
But I doubt he's like sitting there pondering the philosophical implications of his action.
Exactly. So the question becomes, do they have concepts in the same way that we do?
Right.
Especially, complex or abstract ones.
Yeah. It's hard to imagine my dog, like, having concepts like justice or democracy.
Right.
So if they don't have those sophisticated concepts, Does that mean their understanding is fundamentally non-conceptual?
Yeah, that's a key point of debate.
Mm-hmm.
If they don't have those kinds of concepts,
Mm-hmm.
then their representations must be non-conceptual.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, we're left with this idea that their actions are just reflexes,
Right.
devoid of any real understanding. Of course, this all hinges on how we define concepts in the first place.
Right.
Is it simply about discrimination,
Okay.
being able to tell the difference between things and respond accordingly?
Mm-hmm.
Or does it require a deeper level of understanding, the ability to grasp abstract relationships and categories? So we've got all this evidence pointing to this possibility of non-conceptual content.
Right.
But if we can't pin it down with concepts, how do we even describe what it is?
Right.
It feels like trying to explain color to somebody who's been blind their whole life.
That's the million-dollar question. And philosophers have come up with some intriguing ways to tackle it. There are global accounts,
Okay.
which essentially argue that all mental content is non-conceptual at its core,
Oh, wow.
even our thoughts and beliefs.
So even when I'm thinking, man, I really need a coffee that's actually non-conceptual, deep down.
According to these global accounts, yes.
Wow.
They might use frameworks like, possible worlds or Russellian propositions to try and make sense of this idea. Think of it like describing the world in terms of relationships between things rather than using specific concepts.
Okay. So we've got the globalists who say it's all non-conceptual.
Yeah.
What about the other side of the coin?
Right. Then we have what are called local accounts, which take a more targeted approach.
Okay.
These are often tailored to specific domains like perception. For example, Christopher Peacock, a prominent philosopher in this area, proposed something called scenario content.
Scenario content. Okay, break that down for me.
Imagine building a detailed 3D map in your mind,
Okay.
capturing every nuance of what you see, even if you don't have words or concepts for all of those details.
Okay.
Right? You're representing all the spatial relationships, the textures, the colors, the shapes, but not necessarily labeling them with concepts like tree, round, or rough. That's the basic idea behind scenario content.
So it's like this super high-resolution image in your mind that's capturing way more than you could consciously process or put into words.
Exactly. It's about representing the richness of your perceptual experience in a way that goes beyond the limitations of our conceptual vocabulary.
Okay.
There are other local accounts, too.
Okay.
Some use teleological explanations, suggesting that the content is essentially whatever the brain evolved to detect.
Right.
For vision, that might be things like edges, shapes, movement.
So our brains are pre-programmed to pick up on certain features of the world that were it's essential for our survival, way back when.
Exactly.
Makes sense. Knowing whether something is coming towards you or away from you is probably pretty important for our ancestors.
Precisely. And for creatures that are more action-oriented, maybe their non-conceptual content is all about possibilities for interaction rather than about forming beliefs or making judgments about, truth and falsity.
Okay.
It's about understanding what they can do in their environment, not necessarily what's true about it.
So it's less about having a mental model of the world and more about having a toolkit for navigating it.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
It really highlights how diverse the possibilities for non-conceptual content might be. But here's a mind-boggling thought. Can this non-conceptual content actually exist completely separate from concepts?
Ooh.
Can you have pure, unadulterated non-conceptual content without any conceptual scaffolding at all?
That's a tough one. I feel like those two are so intertwined, it's hard to imagine one without the other. Where do philosophers land on this?
Well, initially, Peacock argued that you need at least some basic concepts to understand things like space and your own position in it.
Okay.
Right, you need some sort of conceptual framework to make sense of those non-conceptual representations.
So it's you need a basic blueprint,
Yeah.
even if you're filling in the details with non-conceptual content.
That was his earlier view.
Okay.
But later on, even Peacock came around to the idea that you could have something like non-conceptual points of view.
Okay.
It's about having a sense of where you are in the world without needing a fully fledged concept of self.
Wait, so you can know where you are in space without having a concept of you as a distinct entity? That's wild.
It might seem counterintuitive, but that's what some philosophers propose.
How does that even work?
Well, think of it like having a U-shaped hole in your representation of the world
Okay.
without necessarily having a concept of you as the thing occupying that hole.
Right.
It's a fascinating and complex issue.
Yeah.
And one that, philosophers are still actively debating.
This whole discussion is making me question how much I really understand about my own mind, It's
Yeah.
like there's this whole hidden dimension of mental activity going on
Right.
that I'm only just now becoming aware of.
That's the beauty of philosophy. It challenges us to question our assumptions
Yeah.
and explore the depths of what we thought we knew.
Right.
And with non-conceptual content, we're really just beginning to scratch the surface.
Yeah. It really is incredible to think about all of this, like happening beneath the surface of our everyday awareness.
Mm-hmm.
This whole conversation about non-conceptual content, it's making me just like question the very nature of thought
Right.
and experience.
Right. It is a profound shift in perspective.
Yeah.
It challenges us to kind of reevaluate some of our most basic assumptions about how we understand the world and even what it means to be a conscious being.
So after this like whirlwind tour of non-conceptual content, what are some key takeaways that our listeners can like really sink their teeth into?
Well, firstly, I think the evidence is pretty strong that our perceptual experiences are far richer and more nuanced than we typically give them credit for.
Yeah.
We might not have a distinct concept for every shade of color we can see or every subtle variation in sound,
Right.
but our senses are capturing that information nonetheless.
It's like our perception is giving us this high-definition surround sound experience of the world, even if our like conceptual minds can only process a smaller, lower resolution version of it.
Precisely. And secondly, I think this whole discussion pushes us to reconsider the relationship between our thoughts and our experiences. If non-conceptual content is real, it means that there's a way of representing the world that doesn't rely on those neat categories and labels that we create with concepts.
It's like acknowledging that there's a level of understanding that operates like beneath language,
Yeah.
a kind of intuitive grasp of the world
Yeah.
that might even be more fundamental
Right.
than our conceptual thought. It makes you wonder if we're like sometimes too quick to dismiss intuition
Yeah.
or, gut feelings.
But that's a great point. And finally, I think thinking about non-conceptual content opens up all sorts of fascinating questions about the very nature of consciousness.
Yeah.
Could it be that our conscious experience is built upon this foundation of non-conceptual content?
Right.
Could this even help us understand the minds of creatures who don't have language,
Right.
like animals and infants?
Yeah. It's like we're catching glimpses of a more like primal form of awareness,
Yeah.
a way of being in the world that like predates our sophisticated cognitive abilities. Maybe there's a deep connection to the world that we like lose touch with as we develop language and more complex conceptual frameworks.
Perhaps there's wisdom to be found in that preconceptual space.
Yeah.
Maybe by tuning into our non-conceptual awareness, those feelings and perceptions that we can't easily put into words, we can actually access a deeper, more intuitive understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
I love that. It's like acknowledging that there's like more to our minds than we can easily express or explain. So to our listeners out there, I encourage you to pay attention to those moments when you understand something that you can't quite articulate. It might just be a glimpse into the fascinating realm of the non-conceptual.
Indeed. Perhaps there's a whole universe of understanding waiting to be explored, if only we can learn to listen to those quieter, more intuitive whispers of our minds.
Until next time, happy diving.